All right, so we are starting a new topic today. Topic 6, the Great Depression and the New Deal. And this topic will bring us all the way essentially to World War II. So let's pay attention. Let's think about trends. Like, what have we noticed the last few topics? Trends politically, trends in the economy. We can be thinking about the legacy of progressivism here, Americans' tolerance for government intervention or involvement in the economy, the market economy, this idea of laissez-faire. How are things sort of maintaining trends, challenging trends, and things of that nature. Here are the vocab terms. Just make sure that you are on the lookout for these concepts, people, places, things, as we move forward. And here are your sort of key to-dos, right? Make sure that you can identify how weaknesses in the economy in the 1920s caused the Great Depression, identify the causes of the Great Depression, and discuss how historians differ about them. Because there is a debate over what did cause the Depression and which causes were most significant. Examine the spread of unemployment in America's cities. Analyze the effects of the Great Depression on farmers. Analyze the impact of human and geographical factors that created the Dust Bowl. Describe how the Great Depression affected family life and the lives of African Americans and Mexican Americans. Contrast Hoover's approach to the economic crisis with Franklin Delano Roosevelt's approach, or FDR. Describe the programs that were part of the first New Deal and their immediate effect on Americans' lives. Identify the social and political contributions of Eleanor Roosevelt, Frances Perkins, and other women involved in New Deal programs. Explain how the New Deal expanded economic opportunities for racial and ethnic minorities. Analyze how the New Deal changed the shape of American party politics and lessened ethnic and social divisions within American society. Evaluate the effect of the New Deal on the historical role of the federal government and Franklin Delano Roosevelt on the presidency. Explain the relationship between the New Deal and the arts. We're going to hopefully be able to do all of that by the time our conversation is over. So during the Roaring Twenties, that's that time period we were talking about in the last topic where the economy took off after World War I. It says many Americans enjoyed what seemed like limitless prosperity. Then in October 1929, the mighty bull market crashed. As production fell and unemployment rose, the U.S. economy lurched into a period of dramatic decline. This is the time period in the Roaring Twenties where people are buying consumer goods at record levels. This little blurb down here mentions cars and radios. Remember, they were going to see sporting events to watch people like Babe Ruth. They were going to movies, The Wizard of Oz. They were, let's see, what else were they doing? They were having leisure time on vaudeville. They were doing things that they hadn't been able to have the time or the money to do before, but because of the prosperity experienced in America in the Roaring Twenties, the early part of the 20s, people were doing those things for the first time. But remember also from our conversation in the last topic that this sort of big, giant prosperity that many Americans were experiencing was not universally experienced. For example, farmers and people in rural communities did not buy into that. People in the low classes were not a part of that. And farmers in particular are a great indication of the economy. Sort of as go the farmers, so goes the rest of the country in a few years, right? If you want an indication of successful economy, then you want to look at your farmers and your rural communities and see that they're doing well. When farmers start to do poorly or at least lag behind the rest of the nation, then you know that you're in for some trouble with your wider economy. And you do see that, and we're going to talk about that. So who is in charge here in 1928? Remember, Herbert Hoover had been heavily involved in Wilson's administration, Harding's administration, So Herbert Hoover is that's what I meant to say. I'm sorry. Herbert Hoover is going to be a Republican who's going to be nominated and run against Al Smith, who is a Democrat. Hoover is riding the wave of Calvin Coolidge's popularity. Remember, Calvin Coolidge is Silent Cal. He's a very popular president because the economy is doing very well and he doesn't have any major scandals. But there were some problems with Al Smith. Al Smith is associated with Tammany Hall, which means he's associated with political corruption. Remember Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed, the political machine and the party boss in New York. And Al Smith is also Catholic. And for nativists and other Americans, that's a problem. So Herbert Hoover is going to easily win. He's easily going to carry both the popular and the electoral vote. And he says, "I have no fears for the future of our country. It is bright with hope." A little something about the Silent Cal in the election.
The 36th presidential election in American history took place on November 6, 1928, the day I turned negative 53. Calvin Coolidge had a smooth second term. The economy remained strong, and the federal government even had a huge surplus. If he wanted to run for another full term, he probably would have been easily reelected. However, Coolidge had announced the previous summer that he had no intention of running by cutting out strips of paper with the statement, "I do not choose to run for president in 1928" on them, and handing them out to reporters at the press conference. Coolidge said after the slips of paper were handed out, quote, "There will be nothing more from this office today," unquote, and he walked out. So this left the Republican nomination wide open. The leading candidates were Herbert Hoover, the Secretary of Commerce, Frank Orrin Lowden, the former governor of Illinois, and Senate Majority Leader Charles Curtis, who was from my home state of Kansas. Not impressed by these choices, many Republicans tried to draft Coolidge, but Coolidge turned it down. Hoover ended up getting the nomination, with Charles Curtis as his running mate. The Democratic Party nominated Al Smith, the governor of New York, who was running for president a third time. Smith was the first Roman Catholic to be a major party's candidate for president. The Democrats nominated Joseph Taylor Robinson, a U.S. senator from Arkansas, as his running mate. Robinson and Smith seemed like the odd couple, but actually complemented each other well. No third parties really stood out during this election at all, and so we had another classic two-way battle. Hoover had the momentum due to the fact that things were going pretty darn well overall in the country. In fact, at Hoover's nomination acceptance speech, he said, quote, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of this land. We shall soon, with the help of God, be in sight of the day when poverty will be banished from this land," unquote. Little did Hoover know that soon those words would come back to bite him in the butt. However, things were looking pretty good now for him, especially since Al Smith's religion became a major issue during the campaign. Many Protestants feared that Smith would take orders from the Pope if he led the country. In addition to anti-Catholicism, Smith's opposition to prohibition and his association with the corruption of Tammany Hall likely would cost him votes. And here are the results. Herbert Hoover easily won, becoming the 31st president in American history. In the Electoral College, he dominated so much it was a bit embarrassing for the Democrats. Hoover received 444 electoral votes and even won states like North Carolina and Virginia, which hadn't voted Republican since 1872. Al Smith received just 87 electoral votes. Hoover also dominated with the popular vote, getting 58.2% to Smith's 40.8%. It was safe to say the Republicans were on a roll, as this was their third consecutive presidential landslide victory. Charles Curtis became the 31st vice president in American history. Fun fact and spoiler alert, this was the last presidential election in American history won by Republicans without either Richard Nixon or a member of the Bush family running for them. Pretty crazy, eh? I'll see you for the next election, buddy.
Okay, so that is, I'm going to go back here. That is a really significant margin of victory. Republicans are incredibly popular, but something is going to happen to Herbert Hoover because you guys have probably heard of him and you've probably heard that he is generally regarded as doing a horrible job and responsible for the Great Depression. I personally think that that's debatable. We have to remember that in 1928, the accepted wisdom for how the government should interact with the economy was that the government should not interact with the economy. That there were no established precedents, there was no playbook on the government involving itself to fix an economic crisis. Everyone, all of the respected economists would tell you, wait it out. The government needs to wait it out and let the market correct itself. Hoover did try to support those who were hurting, but he didn't do enough to involve himself in the economy and fix it on that sort of larger level. And yes, he should have, but I don't think that he's necessarily deserving of all of the blame for what happened with the Great Depression. But he gets it, and Republicans get it, and that's why we end up with Democratic presidents until Nixon. All right. So in 1929, this is a nice little pie chart of income distribution, and it tells us a little bit about what we were talking about a second ago with that picture of the affluent family, where yes, there is sort of record prosperity in the early part of the 1920s, this roaring 20s period, but it is not extended to everyone. So the top 5% of income earners, you see there in the green, and the remaining 95% of income earners. You can see that disparity, how much the upper class is taking home versus how little the rest of the nation is. And so, yes, there's record prosperity, but it does not extend to everyone in the country. So by 1929, some economists start to notice that stock prices are soaring, but they're not soaring based on anything real. They seem to be soaring based on just confidence that they will continue to soar. That's dangerous. The prices have no basis in reality. Some experts disagree, but eventually it becomes clear that people are pouring too much money into something called stock speculation. As investors gambled with money, and money that sometimes they didn't have, sort of like pretend money or imaginary money that they thought they would make, they're gambling on high-risk stocks, hoping to turn a profit quickly. But if the market's upward climb were to reverse, investors would face certain economic devastation, and that's what happens. So the stock market crash marked the beginning of the Great Depression, a period that lasted from 1929 until 1941, in which the economy faltered and unemployment soared. Though it did not start the Depression by itself, right? The stock market crash is a symptom of the Depression, right? Of the coming Depression. It did not start the Depression by itself. The crash sparked a chain of events that quickened the collapse of the U.S. economy. And you see a picture here of people going to banks to try to get their money out of a bank. So it says, when the depositors went to the Union Bank in New York City in 1931, they could not withdraw their money. How do you think the American public reacted to bank failures? So this is an image of a run on a bank. And if you can imagine for yourself, when you go and you deposit money in a bank, there's not a vault back there with a box with your name on it where they're putting all your money. Banks are investing your money. Now, today, because of the events of the Depression, banks are required to have insurance, and they're required to keep a certain amount of their money in Federal Reserve banks, right? But that wasn't the case in 1929. And so when the stock market crashed, the banks lost the money that they had invested, which is your money, right? So when everyone showed up at the same time, the banks did not have anyone's money. And so people who were depositing money into banks lost almost all, if not all, of the money that they had deposited. Some of you may have like great grandparents who like didn't trust banks and didn't like to put money in the banks. This is why people lost confidence in these institutions. So the stock market crash. The market's going to peak in September of 1929. Buying starts to slow down, and so some people start to sell off their stocks. Then margins are called. We're going to talk about buying on margin in a second, which essentially exposes the fact that stocks are worth less than what they were purchased for. So up there on that little slide, it says, analysts warn of an end to the bull market. Investors start to sell. Stock prices fall. Companies start to slow down what they're making. And in one day, it says investors lose so much money in one day, right? $14 billion on the 28th and 16 on the 29th. October 29th is known as Black Tuesday. Banks are considered weakened. ultimately collapse. And that leads to these run on the banks, which are these pictures that I'm showing you. And if you've ever seen It's a Wonderful Life, there's a clip in this movie where you see everyone going to the bank to get their money. I'm going to play it.
Don't look now, but there's something funny going on over there at the bank, George. I've never really seen one, but that's got all the earmarks of being a run.
Now, just remember that this thing isn't as black as it appeared. I have some news for you, folks. I was just talking to old man Potter, and he's guaranteed cash payments to the bank. The bank's going to reopen next week.
But, George, I got my money here. Did he guarantee this place?
Well, no, Charlie, I didn't even ask him. We don't need Potter over here.
And I'll take mine now.
No, but you're thinking of this place all wrong, as if I had the money back in a safe. The money's not here. Well, your money's in Joe's house. That's right next to yours. And in the Kennedy house, and Mrs. Maitland's house, and 100 others. You're lending them the money to build, and then they're going to pay it back to you as best they can. Now, what are you going to do, foreclose on them?
I got $242 in here, and $242 isn't going to break anybody.
Okay, Tom. All right. Here you are. You sign this. You get your money in 60 days.
60 days?
Well, that's what you agreed to when you bought your shares.
Tom, did you get your money?
No.
Well, I did. Old man Potter will pay 50 cents on the dollar for every share you've got. Yes, cash.
Well, what do you say?
Oh, Tom, you have to stick to your original agreement. Now, give us 60 days on this
Okay,
thing.
Randall.
Are you going to Potter's?
Better to get half than nothing.
Tom! Now, Randall, wait. Now, listen to me. I beg of you not to do this thing. If Potter gets a hold of this building and alone, there'll never be another decent house built in this town. He's already got charge of the bank, he's got the bus line, he got the department stores, and now he's after us. Why? Well, it's very simple. Because we're cutting in on his business, that's why. Because he wants to keep you living in his slums and paying the kind of rent he decides. Joe, you had one of those Potter houses, didn't you? Well, have you forgotten? Have you forgotten what he charged you for that broken-down shack? Here, Ed, you remember last year when things weren't going so well and you couldn't make your payments? Well, you didn't lose
Okay,
your house.
I'm going to stop it here. But it's a good clip that shows us, not only what a run on the bank may have looked like, but why banks didn't have money in the building and loan is a little bit different from a traditional bank, but it's the same idea. And then also how wealthy people were putting small business owners out of business and how, that prosperity that we were talking about doesn't extend to everyone. Okay. This is a newspaper article. It says the Brooklyn Daily Eagle ran a front page headline that described the fear and panic that spread immediately after the stock market crashed in late 1929. Okay, according to the per capita income and spending graph, were Americans as a whole going into debt during the Depression, or were they just getting by? I'll let you study that chart and consider that question. To be continued.